Hello and welcome to yet another EPP live stream. Today we're very privileged to host our first ever panel discussion on the subject of the future of legalization and decriminalization of marijuana throughout Europe. A small notice before I start the event is that I have consumed some food which might make me leave halfway through the event. If that happens, my lovely assistant who works with me at the EPP will take over to carry on the discussion. I'd first like to begin by saying that we may or may not have a Q&A today, depending on the amount of viewers we have. We had some problems with this event due to Facebook censoring the whole event due to the use of the word cannabis. Maybe that shows some of the attitudes in big tech towards these problems. I'd like to also thank the UCL Conservative Society for their co-host today. Very privileged to have Mr. Dave King with us to discuss this problem from a conservative point of view. And this is quite interesting. This is not a narrative we hear very often, especially in this field of study. I'd like to introduce our speakers somewhat. I'm sure I will give them the opportunity to introduce themselves and give them, and they will have a better opportunity to introduce themselves. But I'd like to first introduce Kenzi Riboulet-Zemouli, pardon my French, who is a European independent and interdisciplinary researcher, and he was the co-founder of FAAAT, which was a think and do tank which dealt with addiction and drug use. He focuses on the legal, political, cultural, and social aspects of drug control laws and policies, and he addresses cannabis and hemp from the perspective of ethics and sustainable development. I'd like to also introduce Mr. Mark Wright, who is the CEO of Reakiro, which is one of Europe's leading manufacturers and suppliers of consumer CBD products. There are products on the shelves of many countries across Europe, and we're very glad to host him. And of course, Mr. David King, who is the Director of Research at the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group, an evidence-based policy forum which promotes evidence-based drug policy. It is aimed at changing conservative opinion towards drug policy. He was also the founder of an academic conference on the use of psychedelics known as Breaking Convention. Without further ado, we'll begin the event by welcoming on our many speakers to the screen. Hello, hi, how are we all doing? I would like to first begin by posing a question to the panel as a whole. When addressing this problem, it's very important to get clarification around some of the words that we're using today. When I say shifting sands or changing currents in European legislation, how would you characterize this legislation? What does this mean to you as researchers and as businessmen? So I have this as an open question.
Well, I think this question of terminology and how we describe different regulatory approaches to activities around drugs is really important. And often this language is misused in a way that can be surprisingly pernicious in unexpected ways. So in particular, the phrases like legalization and decriminalization, I think, can be quite problematic because that feeds into the idea that a drug is either legal or it's not. And of course, the reality is so much more complex than that. All drugs in all countries, regardless of whether we're talking about alcohol or opium or cannabis or crack cocaine, none of them are legal or illegal. It's the activities involving the possession or the sale of them that is regulated. So, for instance, alcohol is only legal sometimes for some people in some situations, and others are not lawful. If you're selling it to minors, you can't do that. You can't drink and drive. You can only buy alcohol from a licensed premises, for instance. And this is also the true with all other drugs. So with the right exemptions or authorizations or licenses, you can manufacture LSD, you can supply heroin. So when we talk about legalization and criminalization, it's not quite as easy as this sort of black and white divide, because legalization, an almost infinite number of policies could theoretically fall under that, depending on what exactly you're legalizing, who is allowed to do what, in what circumstances, under what authority, under that policy. So yes.
And maybe a question to Kenzi. Do you believe that also there was quite a blurring between the different words of legalization, decriminalization, and maybe tolerance? If we look towards the example of Amsterdam, the Netherlands, people usually see this as a decriminalization, but in reality, it might be nearer to just a tolerance. Do you think that these definitions are important when looking at this question?
Not really. I think it's mostly political more than actually factual. In the end, I think Dave made a very good approach to the question. It's all about regulation that already exists. It's just that the regulations that we have are extremely strict, extremely narrow, extremely limited to a series of purposes of use. For instance, only medical but not adult uses or other kinds of uses. And that's mainly the main issue. It's a matter of regulation and a matter of policies and of policy reforms. So there are several levels, like in any other field, several levels of policy reform, several models of policy, and several ways to approach reform. So I'd rather really not link too much to this term, that they might be useful sometimes in terms of communication, but if you want to enter the core of the debate, it's better to not really rely on this term, to my opinion.
And so if we do just that and we enter into the core of the debate, I'd like to direct a question to Mr. Mark Wright from Reakiro. Now, you represent more of the health and wellness side of this argument with the CBD market. Could you give us an overview of the consumer CBD market in 2020 and how that is currently?
I'll just make a comment on the first point. The issue that we face is very directly associated to this conception of marijuana being one thing, which is the psychotropic element of the plant, and the unfortunate consequence of that is that the focus, the decriminalization, the legalization, is all focused on one element, whereas the greater opportunity is to look at the plant as a whole, the industry as a whole, and divide it into parts that are relevant to society and in different ways. You know, I can look at the plant as a provider of fiber, as a provider of material for insulation, as a provider of material for clothing. I can look at it as a provider of medical benefits in the health and wellness area, our particular location. And of course, in the medical side, then there's the application and the recreational element of the psychotropic part of the plant. Mm-hmm. So I tend to try and look at this as a holistic view, as from a plant point of view, almost from an agronomist point of view, and say, okay, we're on the wrong track here. We're talking about the wrong subject. And when I look at places like, and I know this for a fact, in New Zealand, for example, which is looking at a referendum in November on legalization, again, the topic, legalization of marijuana, it doesn't, you know, they can, why aren't they looking at the question of CBD and the relevance to society and THC and the relevance to adult use or restricted use, restricted application? So as a generalized element, that's that subject. In terms of consumers in 2020, the growth of interest is probably the most dynamic factor that we see. The amount of information sought by people who are simply inquisitive about the subject, and those that are really looking for alternative sources of I wouldn't say preventive medicine or curative medicine.
So Mark, if I may just stop you just a second.
Sure.
So we're at a certain point where we have an established CBD market and we're seeing more and more use, but it's not been this simple for forever. There was recent EU debates on the classification of CBD products as novel foods and its use in medicines. What have been the major legal milestones to get to where we are with even CBD, the non-psychoactive component of marijuana?
I'm not sure I call any of them milestones because I'm not sure we're past anything yet. It seems to be rocking back and forwards in the same orbit, mm-hmm. with not a lot of progress. And we can speculate as to the reasons for that. That's not really going to benefit. But really, what it does is that it hinders the access to open market transactions. It limits I wouldn't say the freedom of knowledge, because there's plenty of knowledge out there and there's plenty of information out there and it's growing and it's getting better and better. Mm-hmm. But and the amount of research, and there are certain deficiencies in the sector as well. I mean, we just aren't conducting enough clinical studies and studies that then become peer reviewed and then become adopted as being something that is critical to mainstream adaptation or adoption. So I think there's a number of elements in there within the consumer market, but overall it's growing. The numbers of people who are buying CBD, we see both as a committed purchaser, a return purchasers, and to the experimental, to see if it works, to see if it helps me in my treatment of particular conditions, and if that means that I can reduce the amount of pharmaceuticals that I'm taking. And that's probably one of the bigger areas that we get commentary on, is the users commenting on the ability to be able to downsize the amount of pharmaceutical products that they're having to take for certain conditions.
And now, if I could play devil's advocate here as well, if tomorrow, you talked about they're treating, they don't really break it down to its component parts into looking at the positive effects of THC and CBD. They tried to go for a generalistic legalization approach for the people who are advocating for this sort of thing. What would the impact of legalization look like on your market, on the CBD market? Do you think that you've already laid the groundwork of education towards this, or would legalization hinder the consumption of CBD products?
Well, legalization around CBD would be in several forms. It would promote an extremely rapid level of inquiry, and that's good. I think the factors around legalization are multifaceted as well, because there's a big question about standardization, and as with any product on the open market or on the market that is around wellness and good living, there has to be some standards, and those standards are not there. And I think that's one of the big weaknesses of the industry at the moment, is we're just not seeing enough guidance on what standards should be in place and what producers, manufacturers like ourselves should disclose and be able to be tested on and be able to be compliant with. And we're a strong advocate of that, and we seek that all the time, but we seem to be dancing around the wrong pole, and that's the frustration.
And of course, there's a role of Big Pharma in this. As we start to develop more and more options into introducing CBD into medicines, there is always the risk that Big Pharma will miss out on the new margins, and it will seem that maybe they're looking into new synthetic cannabinoids. Is this a threat to your market in CBD as well, potentially?
Yeah, I think it is, but it's one of those. There are not many products on the market. Well, I don't think there are. I'm not a pharmacist, but there are not many products on the market that have as strong and naturally occurring chemical as CBD or as the cannabinoid range. Full stop. And therefore you're going to have synthetic versus natural, and that's not a bad marketing environment to be in. I'm not afraid of that, and I think that there's a strong advocacy behind the full broad spectrum element to extracts versus a single element, a single molecule production under the pharmaceutical synthetics.
And now, obviously, in European societies, increasingly, there are still some countries in Europe where the import and the use of CBD products is very much illegal. Where I am currently, that is the case. Do you believe that the CBD market helps to soften approaches and helps to soften the view towards using marijuana not just as medical treatment, but for food supplements, for potential use in advanced medicine? Does this soften public opinion, do you reckon? Does this help the argument?
I think it creates a conversation, and creating a conversation is part of changing the attitude. So I think we get to a certain point in this conversation around CBD and the benefits of CBD and the facts that people can benefit in so many different ways. And then we come up against the whole question of, well, what happens to the THC question? And that, to me, is a road which is not difficult to navigate if there was an open mind or open channel of communication with authorities to be able to differentiate the two, firstly, and secondly, to be able to identify how to regulate and just how to regulate in a productive or constructive manner.
Is the THC side of this argument still quite taboo in your industry? And honestly, you must have a reputation as a hemp grower and as of CBD products. Is it quite difficult to make the argument for greater THC products within a market where there are quite a lot of controls on the levels of THC that can be in consumer products?
I think we have very little desire to be a THC producer, because I think it opens a whole area of control is one point, but also due diligence on how it's administered and where it takes you. The conversation around THC has already been there. It's always been there, and it will always be there. I mean, we've had 60 years of prejudiced public relations against the marijuana plant, based on virtual no real knowledge, but just a political will to force it where it's gone. And despite sort of how long, 5,000, 10,000 years of previous societal use from the plant. So, I mean, the argument goes round and round.
And now you're not a politician, but if you look at this politically, where do you think this opposition is really coming from? Do you still hear voices in Europe which are still spouting these same very anti-cannabis rhetoric, as it were?
No, I don't think so. I think there's a lot of inquisitiveness around it, and the time is right to make the changes. The question of where it's coming from, I don't think it's too much of a secret to say that there is a concern amongst the pharmaceutical companies of how they would get into it. Their industry is not built around extracting material from plants generally, and especially big pharma. They would rather create something in a lab, and then becomes proprietary, and then they get the IP, and then they get the margins and the multiples and protection for X number of years. They've set up a beautiful business based on protection. We're setting up a beautiful business based on no protection, no guidance, which is pretty tough.
Do you see the medical argument for THC as being in conflict with the medical argument for CBD? If tomorrow we have a full legalization of the sale, maybe state mandated or by private enterprises, of marijuana products of all classifications, would your business be threatened by this, or do you reckon there'd be a steady demand for the medical argument of CBD products and a medical argument with THC products?
Well, it would only happen around regulations and controls. And if the regulations and controls are put there, then no, I wouldn't have any objection at all. I think it would be a great step forward. And we're only just really uncovering what this plant can do. And we speak very prolifically about the cannabis plant, but there are many other plants around the world as well that have got huge wellness and benefits to health and such like and well-being. But we seem to be one that's tagged with a big black mark.
And with your company, Reakiro, I understand that you work on several other projects related to hemp. What are some of the new technologies that we're finding, or new applications that we're finding for the hemp plant?
Okay, well, the two big ones that we're interested in and invested in are in insulation materials. The heads of the plant, the soft inner core of the cannabis, the cannabis sativa, or the industrial hemp plant, is a very, very exciting opportunity for insulation. It is not only just an insulation; it's also fire retardant. It's also insect proof. It's also very, very. It doesn't degrade over time. It's got many, many benefits as an insulation product. It's the other area that we have completed quite a bit of research in, and very, very interested in seeing it go further, is in activated carbon, hemp as an activated carbon. Its capacity to act as a substitute for graphene, or graphene, is very, very high. It's far better than coconut shells, which are the other form of activated carbon widely used internationally. And if you look at what the components are and the performance of activated carbon from hemp, it's only about between 15 to 20% less efficient than graphene, but about,
Wow.
I don't know, 10, how many, 15 times cheaper or 20 times cheaper. I don't know. Graphene's a rare resource, so it's many, many, many times cheaper. So the application in activated carbon, in energy storage, in water filtration, in any areas where activated carbon becomes a major source or major input, it's a great product, and I think that's got huge potential.
And is research into this material, its advanced uses, is this something that has been impeded by legislation, or are you profiting by the fact that the legislation around these areas are quite hazy? In fact, the private sector in the CBD market has really trailblazed for the lack of clear guidance, as it were.
No, I don't see there's any issue on that. The components of the plant that we are using in these areas has no real relevance, and it's the same as the industrial hemp that's grown in France. I think what is 50,000 hectares grown in France for the automobile industry. So it's exactly the same. There's no impediment for it. There is, you are necessitated by regulations to make sure that your variety doesn't contain THC. And if it does, it gets burnt. So there's a fair amount of incentive to make sure that you comply with the right varieties of industrial hemp to be able to come up with the end product you need in a mature state.
I think what we'll do now is we'll pass on to our next panelist to give us a little look more on the legalization side and to do with the policy and moral and governmental side of this argument. So to Kenzi, I'd like to ask you firstly, in your view, has the government or the community really driven efforts towards legalization in Europe? If I'm thinking of examples within Europe, I think of Christiana in Denmark was an open marijuana market, which is run by a very grassroots community. In Spain, they also launched private cannabis clubs in the lack of government guidance. But then we have the other argument with the tolerance in Amsterdam, which is definitely a mixed approach from the government. Do you see it keeping going as a grassroots movement, or is the government now taking the stride in this?
Well, I think it really depends on different countries. It depends on the area and the state of advancement of local culture and public opinion, probably also politicians' opinion. Mostly in the past, it's clear that, probably with the only exception of the Netherlands, which is often an exception, it's been a movement driven by civil society, patients group, or even doctors group, researchers, and now for the particular case of CBD by the private sector, which is for CBD for the moment mostly composed by small and medium enterprises or startups. So it's been we can say that it's been a successful civil society, several decades of pressure to get this law at least addressed, maybe not immediately changed. I think the best advocate, honestly, to drug policy reform generally and cannabis policy reform as well, the best advocates are the current laws that we have, what we call prohibition, which is sometimes prohibition de facto, which is not necessarily directly enshrined in law, but this sort of paradigm of prohibition is the best advocate against itself, because for decades of implementation, it has only failed to meet its goal, which were to limit access only for medical uses and eradicate other uses. It has only managed to do the exact opposite, which is hindering access to medical uses for the different drugs under control, including cannabis. And at the same time, I'm not sure it's directly prohibition which is responsible for that, but we've seen a rise in the consumption of the non-medical consumption of controlled substances, and also the apparition of new substances that are not under control and that fall out of the full system. So the best advocate for policy reform are the policies themselves that we have that are just a failure.
Mm-hmm. And do you see...
So in a way, we could say that it's government by their inaction.
And do you see decriminalization as a desirable step? Lots of people use decriminalization as an argument for a progressive society that they are moving towards more lenient penalties on drugs and targeting only dealers. Does this actually change much, or does this just shift social ill related to these drugs to different sections of society?
So again, it gets back to the short discussion we had at the beginning, but decriminalization, legalization, these are words that can mean different things depending on the stakeholder or the context, and that often mean not much. Decriminalization, depenalization, dejudiciarization, there are several levels. What does that mean? Is it de jure? Is it in law? Are we changing law to take off penalties? We're not going to decriminalize drugs, as Dave was saying. We have to decriminalize activities that were criminalized. So are we decriminalizing just use, where use is criminalized? For instance, in France, are we decriminalizing possession, cultivation for personal purposes? These are all sort of modalities or different kinds of decriminalization. So it doesn't really make sense to talk about this sort of huge concept of decriminalization. But definitely what I think we can say in 2020, after a series of constitutional courts and Supreme Courts in different countries in all continents, Mexico, South Africa, Georgia, have come up with a similar set of arguments, basically relying on the right to privacy, saying that the criminalization of private activities by people, in particular in private spaces, is not constitutional in regard to the fundamental rights enshrined in some constitutions. So it's for me, decriminalization is should, I mean, obviously, the non-criminalization of personal activities that relate to controlled substances is something that should not even be discussed, because it's a question of fundamental human rights. So it should be a sort of basis. So obviously it's a step to take, which is a step to comply with the respect of the right to the right of privacy. So I would frame it in that perspective.
Mm-hmm. So I understand as well, you might have been involved with this in some capacity, but the UN World Drug Report was published in, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was 2018 or 2019, which found in favor of decriminalization in Europe, but did not find in favor for legalization, as he quoted. Why are nations so open in saying that they are favoring policies which support decriminalization, but there seems to be no appetite or very little appetite in major European nations to follow up with these policies, even when backed by UN reports and public support?
It's really a complex question that you're asking. I'm not sure what UN report you're referring to. I'm thinking you're probably thinking about the INCB reports, which is one particular body of the body associated with the United Nations, which has a certain opinion, which is not necessarily that of the United Nations, since they represent all member states. So the United Nations per se has no real opinion to give on cannabis policies, on the content of cannabis policies. What they can say, since they are a garant of human rights, is indeed to defend this human rights approach to non-criminalization. The United Nations, they frame it not necessarily in the perspective of the right to privacy, but rather in the health-based approach, in the fact that criminalizing these activities in the end generates harm or makes harm to health, more harmful, increases harm to health for the people that consume drugs. And so that's on that basis mostly that the United Nations, a group of United Nations agencies have come up with this recommendation to stop criminalizing drug use. We have also the UNS that came up with an approach on the basis of discrimination, saying they are identifying laws that discriminate people, again also in the access to healthcare services, etc., and pointing at among others drug control policies.
So I understand as well that you spent quite a lot of time in Spain, in France. Do you still see, or we've seen an increase in some of the social harms that come with these heavy government penalties against the personal use of marijuana. For example, we've seen many spikes in gang-related crime and things like this. Does this not pose to governments an ethical question as to whether their policies are truly working? And are we really seeing any real reflection on the impacts of these government policies?
That's another good question. I think we are seeing some changes. For instance, you probably know about the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which is basically an NGO created by former head of state or government or high-level personalities that recognize that having taken part to the enforcement or even the creation of these policies, that acknowledge their failure and advocate for a change. So there is definitely a movement in that direction from different kind of stakeholders. Then I'm not sure that the issue is fully captured. For instance, I was mentioning before the INCB, the International Narcotics Control Board, one of the UN-related agencies, and they countries that have changed, regulated the access to cannabis for medical purposes and the production, cultivation, processing of cannabis for medical purposes, they are often advised by the INCB to implement extremely strict, extremely exceptional security measures that are not necessarily recommended by the same organization for opium poppy fields or other facilities where controlled drugs are handled. So there is a feeling by some people that policy reforms might bring more violence, which is absurd, but that feeling sort of fuels a desire for an over securitization of legally regulated market, which is often fueling violence itself. Yes.
Can I ask you, you say that this fear of a swift legalization and the perceived public increase in criminal activity that might bring, which is demonstrably false, but is this really a lack of public support which is driving, well, which is rather impeding any further action in this field? Or is it somebody behind, is there a group of people behind closed doors who are actively opposing this? Are the government's actions on keeping these very draconian legislation in place, is this due to public support, or is this due to rather frozen structures within the government?
Honestly, I think there is both. To my opinion, the main problem in the field of changing cannabis policies or drug policy reform generally is the fact that we continue to be, even though we try to escape from this paradigm of prohibition, as it's called, we still sort of feel we have to create sui generis policies for cannabis, policies that would exist only for controlled drugs and that will be separated in particular. I'm not sure it's the right approach, and I often, maybe if there are some viewers that are used to hear me, they probably get bored with this example, but that's I think a very good example. Chili pepper is a plant that has variety of uses. It's used, capsaicin is the active compound, the hotness thing of chili pepper. Capsaicin is used in medicine. There are also herbal preparation used in compounding medicine based on the actual chili pepper plant. So there is synthetic and natural capsaicin. There are raw botanical chili pepper medicines. Chili pepper is also used in the confection of cosmetics, which are not medicines. We obviously use it in foods and can grow it on our balcony. Each of these uses have its own particular regulation, set of policy, laws, rules, standards, and some don't have. For instance, growing the chili pepper on your balcony, no specific rule apply. And again, the rules that apply in function of the purpose of use, of the final use that is made of the market, of the actual reality of the product that is crafted from the plant, not from the percentage of capsaicin between the different varieties of chili pepper plants, etc., etc. So I think it's really a good way to frame the reflection about cannabis policy reform, but also the drug policy reform for other plant-based drugs, in this way that maybe we should shift away from this politics of exceptionality or sui generis approach to law and policy making, and adopt a really normalized, in the end, standard policy approach to cannabis and to drugs. So I think the main obstacle to regulation for the moment is the fact that we think we have to create from the onset a whole new set of rules, etc., whereas we already have 90% of it that is existing and that we should rely on.
Mm-hmm. And
obviously
so
with some adaptation, but yeah.
So is this a process which will take part through, again, I'm sorry to keep bringing back to systems of government, but you really have to think in the scale of how this might play out over Europe over the next 20, 30 years. Are we looking at the EU or somebody setting some groundbreaking guidance which allows nations to look to liberalize, or do we need new civilian-based organizations, or do we have to wait naturally until the natural pressures from these draconian drug laws create a collapse in itself and force governments to revoke these criminal penalties?
To my opinion, it's a shift, progressive shift that is going to happen. The important thing to consider is that I think, to my opinion, the basis of all drug control laws and policy in the world are a set of 3 international treaties that have been always read as extremely prohibitionist and restrictive, and etc., etc. And to my opinion, they are not necessarily. They could very well be interpreted differently, or have another address of these treaties, which is compatible with the reform that are often expected by people, by communities, and by governments. So I think it's a matter of again, with the same cards on the table, maybe reinterpreting things, and it's not necessarily a one strike focus. For instance, you talked about European policies before. Obviously, we have the policies of the European Union. We have member states' policies, sometimes at the regional level. I'm living here in Catalonia. I know about regional level policies, but we have also other approaches. For instance, I was mentioning chili pepper, which is in the European Pharmacopoeia as a medicine, and the European Pharmacopoeia applies. It's not linked to the European Union; it's linked to the Council of Europe. It is applying from Russia to the United Kingdom. So it is possible that a monograph of cannabis or some cannabis products might enter in the European Pharmacopoeia, and that will bring changes in countries from Russia to Ireland. So it's again shifting away from this approach of monoblock cannabis policy, or we should sort of push something at once, towards something of more, what is cannabis? If it's a cosmetic, well, let's address cosmetic policies and see what they say, and how does cannabis fit in, what is the fundamental difference that it has with other cosmetics, and address this difference particularly. That's, again, I think the main underlying issue.
Do you understand why this may seem a bit disheartening to some people who look to other countries, who look to very grassroots political movements in countries like Chile, or even not Chile, Uruguay, and the United States of America, and say, why can't we achieve this? And do you see this as an inherently political issue which can be tackled as a political issue? And as you see here, we have very much the opposite side. We have the traditionally, we have a conservative opinion here, which is not traditionally associated with legalization. Should this be a political argument? And if it's not, then how come through grassroots movements in other countries they've achieved that end?
It's to my opinion, it should definitely not be politicized to the extent that it is right now, and I think it could be easy for these topics to escape politicization. I'm not sure how to say that in English. Sorry, but to escape this trap. Unfortunately, indeed, we've seen that. Fortunately for the planet, but unfortunately for this idea of putting the topic out of the political debate, it's been two progressive governments that included in their campaigns the fact that they were going to regulate cannabis in Uruguay and in Canada, that did it. So it seems to indeed be linked to political courage at some point, or at least at some extent. And for the moment, it's not particularly been the conservative being at the forefront of that move. But I'm not sure. I mean, I've been witnessing the debates on drug policies that are going on a bit underground in the Assemblée Nationale in the French Parliament. But since 2014, since the major reform of the public health code, public health law, under the previous government, it's been a sort of continuous debate. And when you are able to sit and discuss the topics on a multi-party basis, you realize it's not a political issue, it's an issue of common sense. And if people actually care for the health of their co-citizens, they actually incline to support harm reduction and to prioritize health responses over law enforcement responses to drug consumption, etc., etc. It just indeed needs to have the good fora for discussion out of the political craziness. And if I may just add, at the level of again, I think it's a topic that should be discussed in that way, but it might not be easy because of what I say. And in the years to come, at the United Nations, the World Health Organization came up with a honestly basic proposal, not revolutionary proposal, to increase a bit the ease of access to medical cannabis products, and the opposition from countries such as Russia and China and many of their allies was very strong and not really supported by much evidence or reflection. So it was very much of a political opposition, and I think it's a pity, in particular in the context of crisis of multilateralism, and in particular knowing that the topic of drug control, even though oriented towards, again, what we call prohibition, but it's been an area where it was possible to find consensus. So we could have expected that the consensus could have shifted toward more health and human rights oriented consensus, but I'm afraid the politicization of the topic is arriving also heavily at the United Nations level. So the perspectives in that regard are not very good.
I think we'll pass over to, I think this is a perfect transition into Mr. Dave King. Now, we're hearing about the regrettable politicization of this problem. Do you see this as regrettable? That this issue is background noise. Sorry. Do you see this
Sorry, yes.
Do you see this as regrettable that it's politicized, or do you see this as a tool for greater progress?
Well, I think it's inevitable that drug control became politicized. I think what's problematic is how it's conceptualized by society and the political establishment. And but what I mean by that is that it's always been couched in moral terms. Drug use, drug supply, it's always been viewed through a moral lens. So the 1961 UN Convention spoke about substance misuse as being an evil. And that's a really strange term to hear for what we might now consider to be maybe a health issue. Cancer, for instance, is very harmful, it's very pernicious. It's very rarely sort of referred to in moral terms. This sort of moral element, this perceived moral element is really crucial, because that's why evidence-based arguments fail. In the push for drug policy reform, it's not enough to have the evidence, it's not enough to have the argument, it's not enough to have the recommendations of professional bodies and doctors and other senior figures. For instance, in the UK, we've had at least 3 major reports in the last 20 years from the House of Commons Select Committees and the Police Foundation and the British Medical Association, which found no strong evidence for there being a deterrent effect in criminal penalties, i.e. the threat of suffering a criminal penalty doesn't affect whether or not someone decides to use or supply drugs. And yet the government has always remained very resolute in its position that that effect exists. And the problem there is that morality is not guided by logic. It's not guided by data. It's an intuitive, instinctive thing. We don't rationally determine that we're morally opposed to something. We feel it. And for people who feel that moral anxiety rise when the issue of drug reform comes up, the data is really not enough to change their minds. And the issue of politicization, how those drugs are spoken about, feeds into that, but so do much wider biases. We have, there are very clear associations with systemic racism, for instance, in the way that drug policies were first conceptualized, introduced, and have been implemented up until this day. You have to look at how drugs and drug use has been portrayed in the media, in TV shows. I think it's difficult to put all the blame necessarily on one cultural sector.
For the sort of moralitis, which especially the UK society, I believe, has. I think this exists very deeply in a lot of other societies. Why did we get to the point where it was a very liberal left and a very traditional moral judgment-based conservative right, or at least that was the public perception? How did we get to that point, and how are you changing this opinion?
Well, so in the UK, the 2 main parties, Labour, which sits on the right, and the Conservatives, which unsurprisingly Labour, which sits on the left, and Conservatives, which unsurprisingly sit on the right, have both been equally conservative, really, when it comes to drug policy. So they've both been pretty egregious on the issue. I should say that I'm not really able to give a conservative opinion, because the CDPRG isn't a conservative group in and of itself. It's that our target audience are conservatives. The government is the Conservative Party. The UK is an extremely conservative country. If the next general election is not for another 3 years, that means that there'll only be one elected Labour MP, Prime Minister, in 40 years. It's a very conservative country. So our target audience is the political right, as the sector most averse to this area. And the question of why there's more opposition to drug policy reform on the right than the left is a really interesting question. In moral foundation theory, the political left prioritize 3 moral foundations above all others. That's care, fairness, and liberty. And those moral foundations are also valuable to conservatives, but no more than the principles of loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And libertarians, as you might expect, prioritize liberty over everything else. The moral foundation of sanctity or purity relates to this sense of abhorrence for disgusting or polluting things. And that really ties into what we were talking about earlier, this moral aversion to controlled drugs, because they're portrayed as being damaging, intoxicating, or otherwise perverting to human faculties and social order. So they're perceived as being impure and subversive, which relates to these moral foundations of sanctity and authority, which are much more important from the conservative moral compass than they are for the left. We see this in our polling as well. So we've shown that the UK public across the board, whether they're on the political right or the left, feel that current drugs policy in the UK is an abysmal failure. Everyone can agree on that. Conservatives, however, are more likely to support stricter zero tolerance, increased enforcement options than they are, for instance, to support regulating the cannabis market. And they're also more likely to describe drug use as being a moral or a criminal issue. And these are, these ideological differences in moral priorities are partly why you see that political split when it comes to drugs. But again, both sides in the UK have been conservative in this area.
When I was speaking to Kenzi, we said that there was a deep problem with politicizing this problem. Is politicizing the problem or targeting political segments really going to work when it seems that political parties or mainstream political parties are not very receptive to cannabis policy legislation? Why go for a political tangent on this when it maybe requires more societal movements?
Well, we've had lots of pro-drug policy reform groups in the UK for decades. I've worked with several of them before, but none of them really appeal to a conservative audience. Drug policy reformists have typically come from the left, because the left prioritize that moral foundation of care above, say, loyalty and authority and sanctity. A lot of those arguments have been very driven in the direction of harm reduction. And while conservatives can get on board with those arguments, there are still other concerns that they have that aren't met by those arguments. So the purpose of our group really is to educate the political right, both policymakers and the voting public, to an area which they are typically less informed about than the political left. So, for instance, in our polling, conservative voters are much more likely to say, "Oh yes, I already knew that," when you tell them various facts about drugs and drug policy, and they're also less likely to be personally experienced in drug use. So, for those reasons, and because there's no point persuading the political left to do anything while the conservatives are in power, and also partly because all the other parties have been, to some extent at least, more inclined to make a change in this area, the priority at the moment in the political spectrum is to get the conservatives on board. By on board, I just mean evidence-based drugs policy at large.
If at the current time the right-wing electorate is not particularly receptive, we have a government which doesn't seem to be making much progress towards it, and an opposition who isn't getting in. Do you ever feel like you're banging your head against a wall when it comes to your efforts? Or is this something that we're looking as actions which will take maybe 20, 30 more years?
I think all drug policy researchers all over the world feel like they're banging their head against the wall. I think that's just part of the job. I do feel, however, though, that changes are happening in a way that hasn't really been observable for a long time, not just with cannabis, but across the board. It's worth saying, by the way, that there is conservative support for, say, certain models of decriminalization and regulation. It's simply that they're more likely than the left to support greater enforcement. But there's more support for, for instance, decriminalization of patients who are using cannabis products or accessing cannabis products unlawfully than there is for criminalizing them.
Would you still say these are tippy-toe steps? These are very, very slow steps, especially in the UK. It's fair to compare to even on the continent, some of the steps that have been taken over there. Is the pace of progress in the UK that slow, or are we seeing any sign of an increased appetite?
I think, like pushing a rock up a hill, every step is incremental until the tipping point, and then suddenly everything happens at once. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we're likely to see here. Huge changes have already been happening, even in the UK. They're not exactly perfect, but for instance, 2 years ago, we had a change in policy that moved some cannabis products out of Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, meaning that they could be prescribed. People have been asking that for 20 years. In 1999, I think, there was a House of Lords paper that made that case really strongly, and it took 20 years for that to happen. Things are a bit different now. There are now advisors in Number 10 who come from a background in drug policy research and campaigning for regulated cannabis markets. And the arguments are shifting as well to arguments that are more appealing to a conservative audience. So, for instance, these medicalization arguments appeal to conservatives because they frame drug use as a movement toward the purity of health rather than toward the impurity of a befuddled or damaged mind, relating to that foundation of sanctity. These arguments that emphasize economic growth are persuasive because that indicates the strengthening of the national community, which relates to loyalty.
Dave, could I play
Yes.
devil's advocate and maybe say,
Please.
well, maybe this is societal. I've just been informed rather recently about in Catalonia. Catalonia has a broad political spectrum of a broad support among both left and right for marijuana legalization. Why is the UK lagging behind in this field? Maybe it's completely cultural and that this is going to be something that never happens in the UK. Do you reckon that different models work in different countries because of inherent traditions or history with drug legislation or even national events?
Yeah, I think there are lots of very complex factors that go into sort of beliefs and attitudes that are held at a social level. The British population do support evidence-based change in drug policy. It's a little bit less among conservatives, but overall we do have a majority for that. Why the UK is a conservative country is probably a more complex question than we have time to address in what's left in this session. But I'm not really sure how to answer that question because there are so many different cultural and social and philosophical and historical factors that go into those sort of into those beliefs.
It's unrealistic to expect the kind of liberalization we see in the Netherlands. Is it unrealistic to expect to see that in the UK? Or if policy-based proposals are put forward to people, do you reckon they could be just as receptive?
Many MPs in the UK government believe that we will have a regulated cannabis market here within the next 5 years. There is no indication yet that is on the horizon, but it's becoming increasingly likely. Mm-hmm. I think the UK has been because centres in the UK like King's College London have been one of the most prolific research centres looking at, for instance, the issue of THC and psychosis. And because those arguments have featured a lot in British media, I think there are concerns that the British public have as a society that a little bit more risk averse. And having watched liberalization in North America, lots of the arguments that drug policy reformists have made for decades, such as regulating the market will lead to decreased strengths of products and greater control, and it'll get rid of the black market, and it absolutely won't lead to increased rates in use. Haven't exactly worked out that way because of the unique situation that you have in the States, disparity between state and federal control, and all sorts of other complicating factors. But the black market hasn't really gone away. That's an issue of how you price products and how you model taxation. Product strength is shot up. And so I think, to a certain extent, a lot of commentators in the UK just want to watch and wait and see what happens. We don't really have any health data that's come out of North America yet. We don't really know what the public health impact of liberalization has been. And while it seems pretty clear to me that there are no observable social benefits to criminalizing people for accessing these products or for keeping that market exclusively in the hands of organized crime groups where no regulation is possible whatsoever, is of course not the right way of dealing with it. I think for much of the British public and for much of the British political establishment, there are health-oriented concerns about letting the genie out of the bottle too quickly.
There might be some right-wing viewers watching us right now and say, what do you mean by liberalization? Especially in the United Kingdom, definitely in France. It's everywhere. Marijuana is everywhere. It's so readily available. The physical presence of marijuana or even harder drugs on our streets is clearly visible to see. Why do we need it liberalized when we have an existing black market which provides for people who want it?
Well, it's a good argument. I mean, I think a good point. I think that there are a few reasons there. Partly, those markets, as one saw with the prohibition of alcohol in the States, there's a shift in the market to the highest possible strength product. If you're unlawfully shipping something into a country or from one position to another, you want something that's going to have the highest yield in terms of profit, and so there's always a shift towards stronger products. So there's that could be an issue. There's an issue of product choice. So, for instance, the needs of patients in the UK are very complex. Different cannabinoid profiles work for different people, different conditions, even different times of day. And more or less, all you can get in the UK market is a fairly narrow range of very low CBD, very high THC products, which doesn't really work for everyone.
Is
So there's limited
price on what is effectively a moral problem? If we give more control for the government to set pricing or to regulate supply, is this not just moving this to a market issue when it's really a moral issue of personal freedoms and liberties?
Well, it's a moral issue in lots of different ways, and there are staunch advocates for the morality and immorality of drug use and drug policy that are completely at odds with each other. Moving everything to or at least moving supply. We know that we can't get rid of demand. That's just not going to happen. Nothing that we've ever tried gets rid of demand. The urge to intoxicate is not just human bound. You can see that across a huge diversity of animal species. In a certain extent, it merely describes the way in which plants and animals have co-evolved over billions of years. So we can't get rid of demand. In terms of what would happen if you moved supply from one source to another, a lot of the same problems still exist for sure. And it's slightly concerning, for instance, when executives and companies that have been selling tobacco for decades are now moving into the cannabis space, simply because there are such obvious public health risks with, say, tobacco smoking, and such a clear history of industry trying to underplay those risks for commercial benefit. And that, you know, there are huge risks of commercialization in lots of ways. If you do it in a way that has no market regulation, then all you're really doing is creating completely lawful cartels with a massive marketing budget. And that's unlikely to reduce social harms. Transform have got this wonderful graph, which has got a sort of U shape, and it's a measure of the sort of control over public harms that you'd have. And you'd have complete prohibition here, where the harms are really high, and over here you'd have totally unregulated free market, and the harms are really high. And then somewhere in the middle, at the bottom of that U, you have just the right amount of regulation.
I'd like to thank our speakers so far. I think what we're going to do is we're going to ask some questions to the panel, and anybody who wants to answer it can answer it. We have a few questions in the chat, which I'll start with first. This one's actually coming from one of our employees. Jonathan asks, if it should happen that Europe will have a huge sweep of legalization of weed or CBD or both, could this potentially really push away countries of the Eastern Bloc who want to be in the EU but have a really big dislike of drugs, or could it be a point of interest for them? Anybody wants to take that?
I'm not really sure that countries in the eastern part of Europe have a dislike on drugs. It's also a political issue in these countries. I know in some countries of Eastern Europe, psychedelic plants or mushrooms are traditional and are somehow much more integrated into the culture than in Western Europe. The cannabis plant also has a long history, and some very renowned varieties are originating from the region of Ukraine and around that region. So I'm not sure it's that much evident in all regards. And I know in terms of, I mean, it's obviously a political issue, so I guess it's also linked to positions that are not necessarily directly related to drugs, but rather on a more broader sort of package of opinions, including drugs.
If I could ask this question to Mark, actually. With Mark, I know that you base some of your operations out of Poland, and you have some experience in the fields of Eastern European countries. Do you find there's an underlying hostility there?
No. It is obviously banned, and this and I think all of the countries this side of Poland have the same situation. But the awareness and the discussion and the debate is very alive. There is a considerable reception to the interest in CBD and obviously THC. As you quite correctly mentioned, Kenzi, the amount of industrial hemp that was grown here was huge for many decades. And it's not uncommon to drive around the roadsides in the countryside right now and see industrial hemp at 2 or 3 meters along the roadside. So it's quite a common occurrence. I mean, that's simply visual. But in terms of the politics, I think it becomes more of a who's bold enough to do something about it, and that's probably the simplicity of it, because these types of countries tend to make bold decisions at times when others may err. But I think at this point, from what we see and what we hear, there is a strong undercurrent of interest in what could be a substantial cash crop for Ukraine on one hand. Secondly, that there is a large amount of research and information available about the industrial hemp and the indica variety as well. So there's I think, as I do respect mostly speak about Ukraine, I think there's a considerable amount of interest, and there's been a lot of government chatter over the last 12 months around the subject. Russia, I don't think so. Belarus, yes, there's been a lot of discussion there at very, very high levels, and that's and their interest in it is because they have the opportunity to be able to link into an extensive cash crop. Again, they're quite likely to be able to make a quite bold decision and go against the tide, since it's a one-man decision-making process. It's not too difficult.
Next question, which is from my glamorous assistant. Why is some of the most liberal countries in Europe with a small actively religious population, such as France and the Nordic countries or Switzerland, have such harsh treatments and laws regarding controlled substances? Danish police even raided Christiania, while statistical studies from 2018 show that even 6.4% of their population as a whole had consumed an illegal substance in their past. So why are some societies quite, even when they're not very religious, so hostile? That's either to Kenzi or to Dave, I think.
Shall I start, Kenzi, and then hand over? So I'm not sure religiosity has necessarily all that much to do with it. People have very strong moral beliefs that are grounded in much more beyond religion. I think I can't comment in regard to any specific country or how religiosity plays into the severity of drug laws. I don't know, for instance, if there have been any studies looking at the religiosity of a study and the severity of their laws. It would be interesting to see that data. But what I do know is that it's common to see a ramping up and up and up of law enforcement responses to drug control, and that's because the tighter that you police a section of that market, the more violent that market becomes, simply in response to what it perceives as state aggression. It has to become more violent in order to evade criminal sanctions. And when there's recently this Operation Venetic, this cross-European massive law enforcement bust that took hundreds of people involved in the drug supply chains, out of that market. And will that reduce demand or supply? No, of course not. It'll just create a gap in that market, which will lead to increased violence as you get more and more competition over the space that's been left. So as you saw in Mexico, for instance, you tend to get this escalating ladder of violence where governments and enforcement agencies think, well, if we just put more resources into this, if we just had more enforcement, if we just had more policing, then that will be enough to solve the problem. But it doesn't. It just makes it progressively worse. But it takes a long time for countries to realize that.
And Kenzi, if you have any comment.
I can comment, but I'm not sure I can really answer. That's a question that I have. Why is this country and not that other? For instance, why in 1967 Spain, which was at that time still under the dictatorship of General Franco, they adopt a new drug control law, but they don't criminalize use of controlled substances. 3 years after, in France, they pass the same kind of law, but they do criminalize the very use of the substance, not even the detention, the fact to put it inside your body. So it was more progressive in Spain, in the dictatorship of Spain, than in France at that moment. And I'm not sure I can explain that, or anybody can. I mean, for the case of France, I assume for the question of cannabis in particular, it's something that is kind of easy to at least feel. I'm not sure we have a lot of data to directly talk about it more further, but there is a strong link. I mean, many of the former French colonies, or the actual French, how do you say that in English? The territories outside of the European continent of France that are still part of France nowadays. These are places of traditional cultivation and use of cannabis in particular, but also opium. So I'm thinking about the Indochina Peninsula. I'm talking about Northern Africa, other parts of Africa, etc., etc. So maybe there is some relation to see in that way, but again, I'm not sure Sweden, which has also a extremely strange drug policy, I'm not sure we can link that to the colonialist history of Sweden. So I really see no easy way to answer your question, and I'm not sure there is a way at all to answer it.
I think I'll ask one of my own questions I had prepared. Maybe I'll put this one to Mark. Can you tell me about some of the overwhelming positives that the cannabis industry brings economically to governments? Do you know, especially, what profit can nations gain by not legalizing, but liberalizing, especially in the production of hemp and CBD products and even THC?
There are several avenues. I mean, the most obvious is simple corporate taxation on successful businesses. We know that the margins are good, and with liberalization, volumes would go up. Certainly, prices may come down, margins may reduce, but the level of profitability in a relatively simple manufacturing process and distribution process would bring, as is evidenced in California, in Colorado. I think over the last 3 years, I mean, I don't really the numbers are accurate, but off the top of my head, I think there was $1.2 billion in additional tax had been collected just simply through corporate tax. It was also a very positive employer, both at the agricultural level and also at the processing area, and more employment, more taxes. The social implications relative to health issues, being able to reduce dependencies, that again comes off the state budget in a lot of cases, especially where there are subsidized pharmaceuticals. I think the opportunity to see the bigger picture is what is being missed, and that bigger picture from the economic point of view, economic/political, and economic and political view, is that there's such a narrow focus on the political consequence of being aggressive towards understanding the opportunity that the liberalization or the standardization of the industry, what that would give and what it would deliver to society is being missed completely. There's not a lot of publicity in that area.
Is there not a fear, especially going into the medical side of it, that if the government gives the green light, especially for the use of CBD as alternative treatments for many things, for arthritis, I know it's good for, is there not a fear that this is going to transfer a quite lucrative market for small businesses into the hands of very large corporations who will run exclusive contracts with the government?
On the medical side, I think there's controls breed naturally that format. But at the moment, there are not a lot of small businesses on the medical side, purely because the capital necessary to be able to establish high-grade API certified facilities that are going to be able to produce the type of product in the consistency and the level required for the pharmaceutical industry per se and medical use is probably going to keep a lot of SMEs out of it. On the CBD side, I think what we're seeing already is a consolidation of distribution. a consolidation even of production, simply because the gold rushes. I wouldn't say the gold rush is over, but it's certainly not as substantial as it was. And as you say, the people who lived longest in the gold rush were the ones that were selling shovels. So it's being able to make sure that you've got something in the business that is able to be substantiated. And I think this is what we'll see the SME area being, because it's an innovation. It's not the same old is going to strike every part of the CBD sector. If it's it can't remain like a pack of biscuits. It's got to be something which has got the added values to it and the added science to it that makes the product more acceptable to consumers and more understandable to consumers.
Another question to the panel from myself is: do you believe that the single issue style of marijuana politics is actually quite a large impediment to the pro-legalization or decriminalization argument? We've seen quite a few movements come and go, pro-cannabis parties, pro-cannabis lobbies, and they never tend to do very well. Do you believe that they're not the right answer, David or Kenzi?
Well, that might get back to what I said before. I think they might not be proposing or explaining the situation in a clear way, or in a way that can be seized by politicians. Again, I get back to chili pepper, and that also somehow can help to answer the previous question. Cannabis in medicine is not just one kind of medicine; it's several kinds. One of these is herbal medicine. Herbal medicine has different protocols, different standards, different regulations than single compound API-based compound medicine. And cannabis can fit into both, but both will have to correspond to different standards, and they have different protocols for pharmacovigilance, different ways of distribution and supply, and different organization for the market. And what we see is that even though it's not perfect, but the producers of herbal medicines are less inclined to be huge multinational corporations. So maybe, again, following this approach, this normal approach, maybe we have a way to find a legal model of regulation that can have a room for all the different stakeholders that we expect to see fit into legally regulated cannabis economy. So, and again, there are also, I think, to get back to the second question, for instance, here in Spain, the cannabis social clubs, it's not necessarily directly an advocacy program. It's just a sort of alternative to the non-regulation by the state, or to too narrow regulation that could not be accessed. In Spain, you can have a license to grow cannabis, but it's just that nobody has it, or very few people have access to it. And indeed, you need to have a huge support that nobody has. Nobody that aspires to have a license will be able to comply with for a couple of years. So they just I don't know, they just thought out of the box, as we say, and they created this alternative model, which is again based on the defense of rights, of fundamental rights, and the right of association being added to the right to privacy. And they have created this alternative model, which is not directly competing with a potential legally regulated commercial market, or not directly competing with the pharmaceutical sector, which can probably exist in addition, just like it has managed to survive in addition to prohibition, or in complement to prohibition. Uruguay has adopted a law where they have passed this cannabis social club as one of the way to access the product cannabis. And here in Spain, there are different regional parliaments, and there are even some initiatives nationally. Also, Spanish politics are a bit stuck, but still there it's something. It's a model that comes from the grassroots, so from the cannabis people's movement, and that has managed to find its way through the healthcare professionals, through the groups of neighbors, through even law enforcement or former law enforcement officials, etc., find its way through to policy. And I think the Cannabis Social Club is a model that we recently, there was a great paper published in the Journal of Drug Issues that's mapping Cannabis Social Club in the European continent, and there are some in the UK that are taking different forms, but it's definitely a model that has sort of gained his room into a legally regulated model, and is definitely worth considering. So probably the best input of social movement is not directly lobbying government, but rather thinking to alternative models that, in addition, solve a series of issues, because Cannabis Social Clubs obviously solves the issues of over-commercialization, of a lot of issues that we've seen. Dave was mentioning the examples of sort of doubt that we have about the way they have been regulated in Colorado. The Cannabis Social Club model is different from that and does not fall into these risks. So definitely that's, I think, the contribution to go away with from civil society, concrete models, concrete alternatives.
I think that was a great answer, Kenzi, and covered a lot. The only thing that I'd add to it, I'm really just emphasizing a point that you made, is that we can think about it as a single issue if we want. We can push for it as a single issue, but the reality, it's not a single issue. It's an extremely complex web that's as big or as small as you want to look at. So we've recently published a big report on medicinal cannabis in the UK, and digging into it, we realized that there were 17 different distinct categories of cannabis-based product in the UK, distinct in terms of regulatory control, or the ways in which they were used, or the sectors in which they were that they were present, and 7 different routes of access through which, and we're only talking about people who are medically oriented, patients that were accessing them, 7 different ways that people were getting hold of these products. So it's, even if you're narrowing in just on cannabis, and one could expand it and say, well, actually, many of the arguments that we're making for cannabis apply to different drugs altogether. Even if you're just looking at cannabis, what you're looking at is an overwhelmingly complex problem that's different in every country, in every jurisdiction, because the culture is different in every culture, in every society, and the actual black and white of the law is a little bit different in every country. So raising it as a single issue is good for raising awareness that there are issues, but it's not enough to deliver a solution, because the fact of the matter is that this is a really complex area of policy.
I just received a question from a friend privately who takes exception to the argument about privacy. For the instance of alcohol, you drink in privacy, but you go out and you could run somebody over. That's a social ill. It could be the same with marijuana. There are definitely some unresearched social ills, and there's an impact on what you do. He's arguing on the basis of a legalization policy based around your own private rights, your own right to do what you need or would like to do in privacy, not valid because it does have a societal impact on others. I think I'll start Kenzi on that one.
Yeah, I think it's not really properly capturing the right to privacy. Again, it's getting back to the activities. What is the activity causing harm? It's the fact to drive a motor vehicle being impaired by alcohol. So that's something that is often not possible to do. You have a different kind of sanctions, criminal or administrative sanctions, depending on the gravity, depending on the different series of variables. That's the same thing that should apply for cannabis, which is just a different pharmacologically active substance than alcohol. So we should apply laws that and policies that address the risks and the actual harms. This of prohibiting use in, I'm not sure how to answer that directly, but the right to privacy you have the right to have different dangerous substances at your home. If you have the right to have knife at home, if you start to go in the street and use the knife to harm people, it's probably a different issue. So it's exactly the same topic here. The right to privacy is limited to your private space. As long as you harm someone else, it's not anymore a matter of privacy because it's already out of your private sphere.
And anybody else want to comment on that? Or if we, go ahead.
Well, the simple answer to it is that all law has to balance human rights against social problems. And this again is why this notion of legalization is a bit pernicious in and of itself, because obviously you can have models whereby access in ways that do not cause major social problems are permitted, and situations that do cause major social problems are heavily regulated.
I think if we have exhausted all the questions that are put to us from the chat, I think that we will conclude here for today. Before we go, I'd just like to speak a little bit about the activities that we do with the European Policy Platform. We are a non-partisan, not-for-profit organisation. We host panel discussions and speaker events with politicians and academics from across Europe. We run entirely on viewer donations, and so I will shamelessly flash up our PayPal address down here. All money goes towards the running of these events and helping to invite new and interesting speakers. And we generally appreciate any donations from £1 to as generous as you're feeling. It really, really does help us with our operations. We also have our website, which is available at europeanpolicyplatform.org, where you can see our future events, and there's quite a lot of information on there, and you can sign up for free membership, and you get a lot more notifications about our events, and hopefully you won't miss out on anything at all. I have nothing further to add, so I'd like to thank our speakers and thank them for their time. This has been a very interesting event, I'm sure, and I'm greatly appreciative of their efforts. Without further ado, I'm going to say goodbye, and we shall end the broadcast there. Thank you very much.